Welcome to the PA Books podcast. PA Books is a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. This program features interviews with authors of books on Pennsylvania people, history, sports, business, nature, and politics. While the focus is always on Pennsylvania, topics like the Revolutionary War, the Battle of Gettysburg, the Industrial Revolution, the coal and steel industries, and authors like John Updike, David McCullough, and John Grogan have a universal appeal. We hope you enjoy this podcast.
This week on PA Books, the author of The Pennsylvania Reserves in the Civil War, Uzal Ent.
Uzal Ent, author of the book The Pennsylvania Reserves in the Civil War. How long have you been interested in the Civil War?
Well, off and on for a long time. And, of course, when I got involved with this book, I got interested in more depth because I needed to properly write about the reserves.
Well, why'd you pick the Pennsylvania Reserves as a topic?
Okay. Well, there's a couple of things. First of all, the Pennsylvania Reserves, a history of them was written 1 year after they left, were mustered out of the service by a man by the name of Josiah Cipher. I have a copy of the book. It was my great-grandfather's. But I knew that one of my great-great-uncles had been in the reserves and had commanded the 6th Pennsylvania Reserves. And as I got digging deeper, I discovered I had another great-great-uncle that was in the reserves. He enlisted in 1861 in an artillery battery, which later became Ricketts Battery. And he served with them until they were mustered out in 1865. Now, he was wounded along the way, but he stayed with the battery the whole time. So when he was mustered out, they made him a brevet lieutenant. I don't know whether that was good for him or not, but so I had two ancestors, and Josiah did a good job, and you could tell that he had kept relationship with the officers of the division all along, because the book came out a year after they came off active duty. But he neglected a few things. One, he did not cover the cavalry regiment, which was part of the reserves. And there were two regiments, the 3rd and 4th, later in the war, were sent to the west, to West Virginia, to General Crook. And he had an expedition going across the mountain and so on. I think what I should do is tell you about how the Pennsylvania Reserves came about.
Sure.
Well, Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers for 3 months. Well, all the young bucks ran down to Washington, D.C. And we didn't know at that time which way Maryland was going to go. So the people in the border counties got very nervous. So the governor and the legislature got together, and they quickly passed an act calling for the formation of the Pennsylvania Reserve Volunteer Corps.
Now, how does the reserve differ from the regular army?
Well, this was just their title. It had nothing to do with the regular army or anything else. There wasn't any reserves in those days anyway, but that's the name they came up with. And I think originally they had in mind to form an organization for the defense of Pennsylvania. When the outfit was first organized, it numbered just under 16,000 officers and men. It consisted of 13 regiments of infantry, 1 of cavalry, and 1 of artillery. The infantry regiments, in accordance with the tables of organization and so on in the active army, there was 10 companies. Each company numbered about 100 men. It had a captain, a first lieutenant, and a second lieutenant. It had 5 sergeants, first sergeant, second, third, fourth, and fifth, and 8 corporals, 1 through 8. And actually, that organization was pretty much the same in 1898. So there were, like I said, 1,000 men. It was supposed to be, but they didn't quite make it. Now, the cavalry regiment consisted of 12 companies. Now, that's not a mistake. That's what they went by, companies. And the companies, during the war in 1863, Congress decreed that those cavalry companies would henceforth be troops. But Pennsylvania said, the heck with it, we're going to stay with company, and they did. And they kept the name of it was the 1st Volunteer Cavalry Regiment, and they kept that reserves in their title. So I talk about them during the early part of the book up until Gettysburg, and then I wrote a chapter strictly about the cavalry.
How did you get to be a member of the cavalry as opposed to the infantry?
Well, they initially they wanted people who knew how to ride, and with this cavalry regiment, they got a man who really knew his stuff. That was Colonel Bayard. He knew horse flesh. He knew how to pick good horses, and he knew how to drill the men properly, which was very good. The artillery regiment had 8 batteries in it. So, as I said, when they were first organized, they ran just shy of 16,000 men. Well, eventually, these people were mustered into state service first, then later into federal service, except the regiment called the Bucktails, the 13th. The 13th regiment was a rifle regiment, and you really had to be a good shot to belong to it.
How did they get the reputation for, because you always hear talk about the Bucktails. What was special about them?
Well, when they were first being organized, their headquarters was in a building across the street from I can't think of it all. A butcher. And hanging outside of the butcher shop was a deer. And one day, one of the men from the regiment cut the tail off of it, stuck it in his hat. And the commander of the regiment thought that was a pretty good idea. And pretty soon everybody had a bucktail. So that's the way they went. So that's how they were organized. Almost all of them, I think, went to camp at Camp Curtin. Camp Curtin was a major training camp for the North. There were people who came from Pennsylvania and other states too. And
How did they select the officers? I mean, when they were putting together a new unit, how did they decide who among them were qualified to be officers?
Well, the men, the enlisted men, voted for the officers. Now, those are the company grade officers. The field grade officers, the ones on the staff and command of the regiment, they were elected by the lieutenants and captains. It was a terrible arrangement, but that's the way it was.
So you didn't have to have any particular qualifications?
Well, I think they often, tried to pick somebody that would be good. Now with the Bucktails, their original commander was a man by the name of Kane. And the men, pretty soon they didn't like him. First of all, he was very careless of their lives. He was a glory hunter. And secondly, he didn't know how to drill the regiment. Now, back in those days, drilling the regiment was a very important thing because they achieved fire superiority and so on by the mass firing of the regiment. And they had to do, during a battle, they had to go through different revolutions in order to stay where they should be or withdraw and so on. So you had to know what to do in every situation. Nowadays, they have drill, but drill now is for ceremonies and marching and things like that. Has no relationship.
Well, when they first got together, were there any people in any of those 16,000 who had military experience?
Oh yeah, there were. Now, some of the men belonged to the militia because we didn't have a National Guard then. But some of the officers, particularly the field, the majors and so on, most of them had some experience. The first commander of the Pennsylvania Reserves was a man by the name of McCall. Now, McCall had served in the active army for a total of about 20 years. But he had health problems. But even so, the governor appointed him commander of the reserves. So that was the state rank. When they were mustered into service, he was made first a brigadier and then a major general.
So they started out as a state unit and then became part of the regular army?
Well, yeah, they were, for a number of years in the beginning of the Civil War, every man was a volunteer, everyone, officers and enlisted. And later on, when they started the draft, the volunteers were upset about these draftees coming in. So there was a little friction there. But they got over it. But I have at home, I was going to bring it with me, there's a board 20 by 30 inches, and it has the pictures of all of the people who served as regimental, brigade, and division commanders. General Meade, he started off as a brigade commander in the reserves. General Reynolds, who got to be a corps commander and was killed at Gettysburg, he also started as a brigadier and then commanded the division.
We have a section in the back of the book that has a lot of information on all the officers who were in the
right.
reserves. Where'd you find all this information?
Oh, different sources. Obituaries, memoirs, all kinds of things. But I wanted that in there. See, I wanted also to have a roster of all of the companies and regiments. But the publisher said that would add another 100 pages to a book that was already...
Well, it's a pretty big book as it is. How long did it take you to write this?
Well, I started at the tender age of 70. I'm now 86. The book was finally published in the first days of this year. My birthday is December 31st, so that was sort of like a Christmas present, birthday present combined for me. I finished the book in 2010. It was at the publishers for their editing for 2 years. And then that took it up to 2012. 2013 was indexing. I did not want to tackle that, but a friend of mine, Mr. Baker, he is at the U.S. Army Military History Institute, and he's a retired, I think he was a sergeant major in the Air Force. He did a real neat job. He wouldn't take any money, nothing. And I know it took an awful lot of work.
Mm-hmm.
So, and one other thing I wanted to mention. There was a number of chapters that I sent to people who I thought were pretty much experts in that particular area. There was John Michael Priest. He reviewed my chapter on Antietam and the Battle of South Mountain, which preceded that. A fellow named Fonts. I may have pronounced the name wrong.
Oh, Harry Fonts.
Right.
Yeah, he's been on this program.
Has he?
Mm-hmm.
I can't find his address. But at any rate, he reviewed Gettysburg for me. John Hennessy checked out my Bull Run. And Frank O'Reilly did the Fredericksburg. I told each of them, I said, I want a completely objective, view of the thing. Well, boy, were they ever objective. I'll tell you, when you write something and somebody faults it, you better be ready to take it. And they really did help a lot.
So you did a lot of rewriting?
Yeah, I did a lot of taking out. I spent too much time talking about the battle in general, for example, and that was true. Oh, another one was William Williams, who's local here, Bill Williams. He reviewed one of my chapters for me too. Now their reward in each case was a copy of the book. You see, I wasn't going to say this, but it's true. the books that I write are heavy. So when you get done reading them, you can use them as a doorstop. But
well, I want to ask you about something you mentioned earlier. You said that they were considered 3-month men when they first signed up?
No. In the beginning, Lincoln called for 75,000 men to serve for 3 months.
Oh.
Now these people agreed to serve for 3 years.
Mm. What did they expect when they signed up? Why were they signing up?
I think most of it was patriotism. And, you know, they wanted to represent their state. The thing about the reserves is, you know, it's an all Pennsylvania was an all Pennsylvania outfit. And they came from all over the state, the most remote areas down into Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and so on. One group floated down the west branch of the Susquehanna in a raft. And they showed up, you know, in all different outfits.
Did they keep people from the same towns, the same parts of the state together, or did they mix them up?
Well, they kept them pretty much together. For example, the 7th Pennsylvania, a lot of them came from Mechanicsville in the area around there. Others came from up around Bloomsburg and so on. So they represented a small area, each company.
Well, you brought along a hat that that is a replica of the ones they used there. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. Yeah, this is a very authentic copy. Now, this horn there, that was the insignia of the infantry in those days. Now, I decided I would use the Pennsylvania Reserve numbers on the hat. So this is the 6th Pennsylvania Reserve.
Mm-hmm.
On the top here is a division insignia. It actually represents the 3rd Division of the 5th Corps. See, they had each corps had 3 divisions. The first one was, their insignia was red, the second one white, and the third blue. So by 1863, that's what they had. You don't mind if I try that?
Oh, go ahead. Can you talk about the colors, the unit's colors, and who designed them and why they were important?
Well, each outfit had the national color, and they had a state, and then they had colors specifically for their regiment. Now, you know, in those days, there was so much noise and so on that oftentimes, particularly a regimental commander, had a hard time communicating. So wherever the colors went, that's where the regiment went. And the colors became, if they got separated and so on, the colors showed them where to assemble. And each one was distinctive. And they got all shot to pieces. I mean, every one of them. And defending the regimental color was an honor. And many regiments lost 3, 4, 5, even 7 or 8 men who would grab the color as soon as it fell down. And in one instance, this color had been dropped by a number of people, and one man went over to grab it. They said, don't pick up the color, you'll get killed. He picked it up and got killed, just like that. So, you know,
How long were these volunteers trained before they were sent into battle?
well, these fellows, like I said, they went to Camp Curtin, and there they got some training, and then they went down to the vicinity of Washington, D.C., got some more training. And while they were there, one of the brigades, it was a brigade commanded by Brigadier General O.C. Ord, Fort Ord, California.
Oh, he's the guy Fort Ord is named after?
Right. Well, he had the brigade, and he had an artillery battery and a contingent of cavalry. And they went to a little town called Drainsville in northern Maryland. And they were there to forage and pick up, different things. And lo and behold, there were some Confederates there. So they had a little shooting match. The commander of the Confederates was the guy who eventually became Stonewall Jackson.
He didn't lose many battles.
Well, he lost this one. Well, they were outnumbered anyway and outgunned with their artillery and so on. And the reserves, several regiments of the reserves charged into them, including the 6th. And so he had to withdraw, and he did. And I don't know how many wagons load of stuff that they got there, but it was, it was foraging for whatever they could get that would help. And of course, when they came back to the camp, they were treated as heroes by the other fellows, and some people from Pennsylvania came down to pat them on the back too.
Well, what was everyday life like for members of the reserves?
Well, their everyday life was pretty much like any other volunteer regiment. They drill. I mean, hours and hours. There would be breaks, but they drilled hours and hours every day. And of course, they pulled their time at being on guard duty and so on. The cavalry was sent out, and vedettes. They were out several miles, trying to mask the infantry back here, and also to make the enemy know they were around. Now the thing about it, the people, the soldiers on both sides, they were just common, ordinary folks. A lot of them had no formal education or very little. And they would, in the early days, when they were out, on picket duty, they used to shoot at one another. And finally, in almost every case where they were there for a while, they decided not to do that anymore. And they would trade, the Confederates would trade tobacco for coffee, because there wasn't any coffee in the South. And they'd make little floats, float the stuff across the river, creek or whatever.
What did the officers do about that?
They didn't like it most of the time. because it really underlined or undermined discipline and their willingness to shoot at one another. Both sides.
Before we get, the reserves were involved in a lot of major battles in the war, but before we get into those, I want to ask you about yourself a little bit. You are retired military.
Yes.
What's your background?
Well, when I was a little kid, my uncle, who had graduated from West Point, was an Army officer, and I wanted to be like him. I always had great respect for him, and I still do. So he was my inspiration. Well, I went to West Point and failed. I failed in German, which is okay. But, strange things happen to me sometimes. And when I left the academy, I was given a letter of recommendation for officer candidate school. Well, I went to Susquehanna University for a year and a half, and I took this paper down to a recruiting office. I said, "Is this any good yet?" They said, "Yes." So I went to OCS. There was a 6-month course in that day. And I graduated and was commissioned 15 months before my West Point classmates.
You joined the Army in 1946?
45.
Oh, 45, but right at the end of the war or after the end of the war?
No, it was the war for the purpose of the Victory Medal. The war lasted until December 31st, 1946.
Oh.
Now, I enlisted in what they called the Army Specialized Training Reserve Program. Now, this was before West Point. And you could enlist in that at the age of 17, which I did. And what would happen is, once you became 18, they could call you to active duty. So I went through that again before West Point.
So the Army was still recruiting as far as late 1945 and 1946?
45 anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So that's, because of that, technically, I'm a World War II veteran. I didn't believe it, but they showed me. But at any rate, I was commissioned in September of 1949. I went to the Infantry Officers Basic Course. I got married, and I left for Japan. But when I was at the basic course, back in those days, they used to take the senior class and fly them to different Army posts, major posts. And they flew my class into Fort Benning, where I was stationed. And they were located at only a short distance. So this one day I went up there to where they were located and walked behind this one guy. I said, "Suck up that ponderous gut, Mr. Eichhorn." He turned around and he said, "Usually." Old home week. I had once a classmate, always a classmate. And I have kept my relationship with the class ever since. Of course, there are not too many of us left anymore.
You were in Korea for a time.
Yes. The Korean War started while I was in Japan. Coincidentally, my wife was supposed to come over to Japan at the time. We had waited the 6 months, but she never got there. Yeah, I was in Korea in the infantry, and again, different things happened to me that didn't happen to other people. The tour of duty in Korea was a year, and I was sent home in 10 and a half months. There wasn't any question about leaving. You know, I wanted to stay one more night with the outfit. A man that I knew did just that and was killed. So.
How long did you stay in the Army?
Well, I left active duty in 1953. Now, when I came back from Korea, you could pick almost any place you wanted. And I knew if it was around here somewhere, I'd have relatives on my doorstep or I'd be on theirs. So I picked Fort Jackson, South Carolina. You see, my wife and I had no chance to know one another. And I had 2 good years there. And they sent me to Europe, and there I was assigned to the 28th Infantry Division. And at the time, there were 2 28th divisions. There was one on active duty, and there was another one starting back here in Pennsylvania, and that was called 28th Infantry Division, National Guard of the United States. So I resigned the Army in December of '53, and I joined the Pennsylvania National Guard, 28th Division, in March of '54, and I stayed with them until the end of November of 1980. 21 of those years I was full-time. It was like being on active duty but never being transferred. I was over here at the Harrisburg military post all that time. Now, originally, the division commander, shortly after I joined up, he called me into his office. It was on the second floor of the armory. He said, "Come over here to the window, Lieutenant." So I went over, put his arms around me. I knew, I'm in trouble now. He said, "You see that company down there?" I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "How'd you like to command that company?" I didn't answer him right away. He said, "I'll tell you what I'll do." He said, "If you take command of that company and do a good job at annual training, I'll promote you to captain." Well, we went that summer to summer camp in September. I was a captain. It was General Henry K. Fluke. He commanded the division for a long time. The other division commander that I knew very well, as a matter of fact, I ended up being his chief of staff, was Nicholas P. Kafkalis. I mean, he was wonderful to work for, and he was a very smart man. We used to go out to Fort Leavenworth each year for a refresher course. And all of the National Guard division, the division commanders, and selected members of the staff went there too. And the chiefs of staff, well, the generals were, talking to one another at a table. And the chiefs of staff were sitting around on the outside, like horse holders. But at any rate, many times these guys would get themselves all wrapped up, and they couldn't find a solution to things. So they turned to General Kafkalis. His name was Nicholas. "Nick, what do you think?" Well, he'd take the cigar out of his mouth. And in just a couple of sentences, he would summarize the problem and then give the solution. It was there all the time. Not one of them had discovered it. Like I said, he was a very good general on many scales. He just recently died in his 90s.
And you were in the Army until 1980?
Well, in the Guard, full time, yeah, till 1980. I had, like I said, I had my moment in the sun. They were most all were good years. The bad years were, well, the bad year was Korea. You know, I did not suffer from this post, whatever it is. But nobody goes into combat and comes out without being changed. And today, I'm sitting there minding my own business, and something from Korea pops up in my mind. And that's the way it is. That's the way it's been all those years. I had a lot of men killed in my platoon. As a matter of fact, the first day of battle, I lost 12 out of 36. And that was about the 20th of July. The 4th of August, the Marines came in and they relieved us. And at that time, I was reduced to 3 4-man squads. So,
well, getting back to your book,
Yeah,
before we run out of time, I want to talk about a little of that, because they were involved in a lot of major battles. But what was the first time they were involved in what's considered a big battle?
Well, the first battle for them as a division was at Mechanicsville. Now, 2 of the regiments were not there. They had 11 regiments there. And they did a real good job. They stuck it out. The Confederates tried to turn the right flank, and they tried also the left flank of the division, and they made no headway at all. Now, they came pretty close on the right flank, but they stuck it out, and then they stayed overnight, and then they were ordered out the next day. Well, they were ordered out in daylight, and that led to some casualties. But they had Gaines Mill. They were there, and there the regiments were pretty much used to push different places along the whole Army front. Put a regiment here, 2 regiments there, and so on. And then there was the Battle of
Well, I want to ask you about one in particular, New Market Crossroads.
that's one I was going to talk
because that
about.
sounded like that went badly.
It did. They put the 3rd and 4th regiments out here forward. The 12th was off on the left, and there were 2 contingents of them, and they were getting themselves ready for the enemy. Well, they didn't get a chance to get ready. The Confederates came and chased them out. And along with them were the men from 2 artillery batteries, and they joined the withdrawal. And I think some people from the 3rd that was out a little further, and this whole mob of people running to the rear. they created the impression of the commander of the corps next to them that the whole reserve outfit just took off, but they didn't. Now, they had a terrible time. They were shoved around, but they were still there at the end of the day. As it got dark and so on, General McCall went to look for some of his men, and he stumbled into the lines of the 17th Virginia and was captured.
Was he a POW for the rest of the war?
No. See, back in those days, before Grant came along, periodically they would exchange prisoners, particularly officers. So he was exchanged, but he wasn't able to command the division. But there was a brigadier general named Truman Seymour. Well, Truman Seymour disappeared. And he showed up at night, when the battle was pretty much over with. And he took command of the division. But he did one thing that I thought was absolutely terrible. You see, you have your artillery battery positioned in one place and back out of, not out of range, but back to the rear in a deflated area where they won't be hit. They would have some other caissons and so on. There was artillery ammunition. Well, he went by this one group and told them to move, so they did. Well, the battery ran out of ammunition, and the commanders sent people out looking. He never did find them. He never found them.
He told them to move and he didn't know where they went?
No, well, the general knew that they were sent back someplace, but he didn't know where they were. And of course the battery commander didn't know either. Now there, he took the firepower of a whole battery of artillery and destroyed it. I had no respect for him.
Where were the Pennsylvania Reserves when the Battle of Gettysburg started to come together?
Well, after Fredericksburg, the division was in pretty bad shape. Well, even before Fredericksburg, it was only about 4,000 men.
Were they getting reinforcements or replacements along the way?
The different regiments would send people back to try to recruit, but that lots of times was totally unsatisfactory.
So Fredericksburg, they had a lot of losses?
Well, they had a lot of losses. Not only that, to bring them up to more strength, they attached 2 new regiments to them. They weren't reserve regiments, they were just 2 regiments, and that increased their strength. Well, on the way in their advance, the commander of the brigade that the 6th belonged to was shot in the left foot. Another brigade commander, his horse was killed and he was pinned, his legs under him. Now the 3rd one was a brigadier, and he was leading his outfit, and he was killed. So, in effect, the regiments of the division did pretty much what they wanted to do. The 6th and some of the others, they went over to this flank. Another bunch of them cornered a large number of Confederates in a hollow, and so on. Now, for about an hour or so, they had their own way. But then, guess who it was? Jackson. He assembled his people and chased them off. This one guy said that they left that hill faster than they did when they climbed up it.
Now, you have a letter in here that, if I can find it, that's a request from the Pennsylvania Reserves to be allowed to go to Gettysburg.
Okay. After Fredericksburg, the Reserve Division was so low in strength, they were sent to become part of the force defending Washington, D.C., and that's where they were. And then when the word came to go up toward Gettysburg, two of the brigades had no problem assembling. The other brigade, they wanted them, and the commander of the troops at Washington said, no, you can't have them. The division commander was so outraged, he wanted to have the guy court-martialed. Well, instead he got a letter, not from this fellow, but higher up. The letter said, that in effect, that those regiments were no part of the Pennsylvania Reserves. Well, they were. It was the 3rd, 4th, 7th, and 8th regiments. It was one of the brigades.
And they wanted to be on Pennsylvania soil?
Well, they wanted to join the division. Well, they got there late in the afternoon of the second day, and they were sent to the flank of Little Round Top, the right flank, and they formed there. Now, what the commander did, he took a regiment from one brigade, and that brigade he sent on to Little Round Top. The others, he formed them up in two ranks, more or less, facing down slope. And
was Strong Vincent with them then? He's a Pennsylvanian?
No, he wasn't part of the reserve. Weed and Vincent were both brigade commanders, but both were killed there. Well, at any rate, the Confederates had been fighting and winning pretty much all afternoon. They had defeated some regulars, that sort of thing. But they were all jumbled together. You know, their regimental cohesion was totally lost because they'd been maneuvering and so on all day long. And they started up the hill where the reserves were located. Well, they fired some volleys after them, and the Confederates did, but then they started to withdraw, and that's when the reserve charged down over the hill and across the Valley of Death to the edge of the wheat field, and that's where they stopped. The 6th Regiment, there was a road that went down this way. The 6th Regiment was on that side of the road, and the rest of them were over here. Now the commander of the Bucktails was with some of his men, and they were confronting some Confederates. and they called for the Confederates to lay down their arms, and they started to, and then one of them realized that there was only a few people there, and they said, I'm not going to surrender to a corporal's guard. So they grabbed their weapons and started shooting. Well, as soon as one of the sergeants of the Bucktails realized what was happening, he said, he just yelled out, "Tree, everyone." That means you jump behind a tree. The regimental commander was too slow and was killed.
Why is it that when you hear about Little Round Top, everybody talks about the 20th Maine and they never talk about the Pennsylvania Reserves?
Well, the 20th Maine did just outstanding. They really held their own, and they proved their mettle, I'll tell you. They really did. They deserve everything that they got.
Well, we're just about out of time, but I want to ask you, you say in the book that the Pennsylvania Reserves were mustered out in June of 1864, but the war was still going on.
Yeah.
Why'd they do that?
Because they had signed up for 3 years. And that mustering out date was a very sacred date to a man who had served 3 years. He wanted out when he wanted out.
Oh, the Army couldn't just say, "Oh, we're extending you to the duration." No.
Now, I talked about the 3rd and 4th. They were sent out to General Crook. Now, see, Cipher doesn't pursue that at all. I have a whole chapter on that expedition. So I tried to fill in some of the gaps. There were 2 batteries, artillery batteries, that had originally been part of the reserves. They were at Gettysburg. It was Ricketts Battery and I think Cooper's. And so I deviate from my normal format and wrote about them too, because they had been reserve batteries.
I'm going to have to stop you there because we are out of time. We've been talking to Uzal Ent. He's the author of this book, The Pennsylvania Reserves in the Civil War, A Comprehensive History, and it is comprehensive. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You've been listening to a podcast of PA Books, a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. We'd like to hear from you. Our email address is pabooks@pcntv.com. Like us on Facebook to learn more about PA Books.